Okay, great. Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Tom Creed. I'm a stage director in theatre and opera, and I'm a member of the steering committee of the National Campaign for the Arts. And it's great that so many of you have joined us today in an eventful week where there have been announcements around the kind of various responses to the crisis, including the pandemic unemployment payment, and also announcement today of additional funding for culture and the arts from the department. So the way the meeting is going to run today, we'll keep it to about an hour. In a moment, I'm going to introduce Angela Dorgan, who's the chair of the National Campaign for the Arts, just to give a quick update on where things are with the campaign. And on some of the recent announcements that affect the arts and culture. And then we're going to hear from Peter Daly, actor and chartered accountant, who's been doing heroic efforts. You might have seen it on Twitter as he tries to get to the bottom of what it is to navigate the pandemic unemployment payment and that whole system as an arts worker. And also Karan O'Loughlin, who represents many Irish theatre workers through Equity and SIPTU. And then we will have an opportunity for questions if there are particular issues that are not addressed by anything that you've heard, or if there are things that you feel need to be addressed in terms of our advocacy going forward. It'd be great to hear from you. We will use the chat function to handle questions. So if you have a question, please type it in the chat and I will get to as many of them as I can. If you can, keep the questions until we get to the bit where I say, does anyone have any questions? Because I won't be taking questions until then, and it means I don't have to scroll the whole way back up the list, and there's less chance that I'll miss your question. Or if you'd like to ask a question actually out loud, feel free to do that, or make a comment and just put your name in and say that you'd like to make a comment. We are going to record the meeting so that it can be made available to people who haven't been able to join us today, but it will be just the speakers that are being recorded. So you don't need to worry about showing your faces, and it's great to see as many people's faces as possible so that we can remind ourselves of the extraordinary community of which we all are a part. So Angela, if you can unmute yourself there and just give us a brief rundown about where we've come from over the last couple of months and what's happening right now.
Sure. Thanks, Tom. Can I also echo that I think Peter Daly is the new rock star of the pandemic unemployment payment and social welfare payment to artists who've been playing a blinder. So I won't take up too much of his time. Just to give you a bit of context for today's work and Peter's work in general, we are using your feedback, Peter's fixes and the fixes from Mary Nash in the department to make sure that the department has an up-to-date memo on social welfare and the arts sector to keep sharing with the Department of Social Welfare. So as many of your responses or fixes or encounters you're having where you're having trouble, as many of those as we can hear from you as possible in order to put it in the memo so that we can keep feeding that through the department over to the Department of Social Welfare is going to be really, really useful. So that's where today's context sits. I will just, I don't know how many of you have just seen the announcement. A further 26 million for the arts has just been announced by Minister from the Minister at lunchtime. In our understanding, and we'll be putting it up in our newsletter now for more of a breakdown, there's a 10 million fund, 5 to go to the audiovisual sector through Screen Ireland and 5 million to what we understand will essentially be a seat subsidy to fund big presentations from theatre and music, both Arts Council and non-Arts Council funded organisations to access so that shows can continue to go on, so that techs, arts workers, sound engineers, lighting engineers, stage designers, stage developers can all continue to be employed. There will be 2 million to go to the BAI to shore up its sound and vision. There will be another 3 million to go to Screen Ireland for the audiovisual sector to make work for TV. And there will be 10 million to go to Creative Ireland, and we understand some of that will also go to the Arts Council and separate initiatives.
I can't hear us. It's
to boost job activity in the sector. So that's the breakdown of the 26 million. Considering on April 3rd, there was 500,000 promised to the sector. This 26 million is really important to the sector. We have requested just clarification on how that will break down and how it can make its way to artists, arts workers and arts organisations within the sector. But 51 million we feel is a good result at this stage for our sector. It's in its entirety. We continue to work with the brand sector and their representatives to investigate ways into some of the remaining aspects of our call. We have now, NCFA has now achieved 6 of the 13 asks that we had in our plan released on May 27th. For the others, just to give you context and give you by way of update, we are working with the branded sector to investigate how best brands could invest more in the arts and philanthropies could invest more in the arts through tax incentives. We feel it's important to hear from the people who will ultimately benefit so that we can better inform both you, the sector, but especially government, because I think, yes, the arts will ask for it, but if we have the people who have the money also asking government for it, our feeling is that's going to be a more positive outcome and a better way to get, again, more money to the sector, in line with our European colleagues. We're a little disappointed with the VAT break. It's not what you as a sector had asked us for. So we will continue to go back on that, and then we will continue to push on the other aspects of our 13-point plan, including the universal basic income. So just for context, to demonstrate to you that we are continuing on the 13-point plan, and while it's brilliant to come back to you and say, yes, the PUP is being extended, there are problems. So now it's up to us to make those problems, to make the government aware of those problems on your behalf, and try and come up with fixes or alternatives. So I'm going to hand you over to Peter and just say a word of thanks from the NCFA to both Karan and SIPTU and Equity, and also to Anna and Irma for Theatre Forum for helping us bring these workshops together. And again, just to reiterate that all of the problems you're having, it would be great to hear them so that we can feed them through the department, and then that they can feed them on your behalf as a sector to the Department of Social Welfare, and hopefully we'll get all the fixes fixed. So Peter, I'll hand over to you.
Afternoon, everyone. Hope you're all doing okay. What a crazy, crazy time. So I've been asked to speak, I'm guessing for about 10 minutes or so, maybe a little bit longer, on the pandemic unemployment payment. I'm going to go from the very start, even though I would imagine that 99% of the people on the call probably know what it is. So basically, it was a payment that was introduced at the start of the pandemic. It was available to anybody who was in employment in or around the 13th of March and who lost their PAYE employment job due to the pandemic. But it was also available to self-employed people who, and I'm using the language from the department itself, whose trade had collapsed to such an extent that if they were offered a full-time job, they would take it. So we took it, anybody who kind of came and asked me about that, I said, look, there might be a dribble of income coming in, there might be residual income coming in from activity that happened before, but you know, your trade has collapsed to such an extent. So it was available to employees and it was also available to self-employed people. And it kicked in at a standard rate of €350 per week. And that was from around the middle of March. And it ran at that rate up until the 29th of June. So what happened on the 29th of June is the rate changed. And this is probably where a lot of the anxiety has arisen. So on the 29th of June, if you were earning €200 or more per week, you were retained at the 350 rate. And if you earned €200 or less a week, you dropped down to €203 a week. So then it came down to how did they measure your income? This is how they seem to have done it. If you had any, so I'm kind of, if somebody is a straightforward employee, their income is what it is, and they look to their higher of their 2019 or their 2020 average weekly income. So if you've been an employee since 2018, there's no question about it. It's just based on whatever's your highest wage. If it was above 200 a week, you got the 350. But where the issue seems to have arisen is if somebody had a blend of self-employed income and employment income, particularly in 2019, 2020. Even if they had applied as a self-employed person, which you could do on the original PUP form, which most people did online, but some people did in paper form, even if they had applied as self-employed, all of a sudden they found that they were being assessed as an employee. So they might have had maybe 6 weeks work as an employee in 2019, and they were assessed on that rather than perhaps their more than 10 grand income as self-employed in 2018. I put various things up. I asked people on Twitter to feed back to me what was happening, if they were cut, if they felt that was unfair, etc. And I got a lot of first-hand information. And almost everybody who was put down to the lower rate that fed back to me that they had self-employed income that was higher than 10,400. 10,400 happens to be €200 by 52 weeks. So that's where the 10,400 is coming from. They came back to me and said, listen, I had more than 10,400 in self-employed income in 2018, but they're assessing me on their 2019, 2020 employment income, assessing you as an employee. So I found one individual who was in that exact situation, who managed to get themselves back to the 350 rate. And it seems the way they did that was by going directly to their TD. Their TD was Joan Collins in Dublin South Central. So I compiled a template email using Joan's name and the reference of the parliamentary question she asked, which got the response from welfare to put the rate back up. And I've put it as a template on my Twitter account. My Twitter name is Peter Daly 10, and you can pick it up on a tweet that I put there today. It's about 6 or 7 tweets long. If anybody sends that off to welfare, and gets a response, either positive or negative, perhaps they would drop me a shout. So yeah, and I think that Tom has just dropped that into the chat, in the chat window. So hopefully that will assist some people. Now that obviously only assists people in that specific case, which is that they're a blend of PAYE and self-employed, and they were being assessed on their lower PAYE income, when in actual fact, if they had been assessed on their higher self-employed income in 2018, they would be in a better position. So here's the advocacy bit. This is the bit that I'm feeding back now to Angela and seeing what other people think about this. A fairer and doable situation would be if they were to assess us on our total income in either 2018 or 2019 or early 2020. That's possible. Okay, you may not necessarily have your 2019 self-employed tax return in, so they might be just going on your PAYE. So hopefully then they'll look back to your 2018 self-employed tax return and include your total income. Because let's face it, in the modern world, and particularly in the world of arts, everybody has to make a blend of self-employed income and PAYE income just to make ends meet. So you could have somebody with 7.5 grand worth of self-employed income and 7.5 grand worth of PAYE income, bringing them well above the 10,400. But in that situation, that person would be kept on the lower rate, and that seems unfair to me. So what I'm saying there is advocating for a total income review. If people feel their 2019 is strongest, they should be allowed to get their 2019 in and let it be assessed on that. This is a long running thing. It's going to run till the 1st of April. So, there's time to get these things sorted. And if somebody gets their 2019 tax return in the next month or so, I don't see any reason why they wouldn't be able to go back and get arrears paid, as was the case in this individual who appealed. The appeal was successful, and now they're going to have their arrears paid back to them. So, and obviously I'm advocating to Angela and Tom and National Campaign for the Arts, and we're all advocating towards the Department of Culture. And the Department of Culture, I think, have been really open and good and really are working on our side. They absolutely want to hear the cases and the arguments we're making, and they want to make this work for us. So, plaudits where appropriate. Okay. So appeals, a lot of people have come back to me to say they've appealed and they haven't heard anything at all. That doesn't surprise me. Either they haven't heard anything, or a small number of people have heard the negative one, the one that has the 2-line, that has the thing about, you're being assessed as an employee and you can only have your self-employed in 2018 included if you've no PAYE work in 2019 and 2020. So some people have got that response, but most people have heard nothing. I just want to assure you that that's not unusual. They've had a huge amount of appeals. One person came back to say when they spoke to somebody on the phone the other day, there was something like 85,000 appeals that have to be dealt with. I would imagine that a lot of people dealing with the appeals have been drafted in from other departments and are just doing their best to get their head around the rules. And hopefully sessions like this will kind of copper fasten the rules so that the appeal that this individual made that was successful can be fed back into the rules themselves. We all know that the pandemic unemployment payment, which was originally only supposed to run until, September, was it? August, September, has been now extended to the 1st of April. The rate, which we've just discussed, is now currently at 350 and 203, is going to change on the 17th of September 2020. And this is how it's going to break down from that point onwards. If your average income was below 200 per week, you're going to get 203 going forward. If your income was between 200 and 300 per week, average income of between 200 and 300 per week, you're going to get 250 per week. And if your average income was above 300 per week, you're going to continue at 300 per week. Sorry, not continue, you're going to drop from 350 to 300 per week. So that's even more of an argument to get this thing sorted about either make sure they know that you're being assessed on your 2018 self-employed income, or that we get this total income model in play by then. So that's 17th of September is the next time this is going to be reassessed. After that, the next time after it is the 1st of February. To be honest, I'm not going to go into the detail on that one because I'm throwing enough numbers at you. You can look it up on gov.ie. So I wanted to cover a situation very briefly that some people have come back on, where they were on job seekers allowance at the time of the pandemic, and they were hoping to go from job seekers allowance to what they usually do, get a little bit of self-employed income or a little bit of artist income, and then continue on with that and perhaps go back to job seekers allowance after that. A lot of people who were in that situation, if they went and applied for the pandemic unemployment payment, the first response they got was, no, you're already on a payment and you're going to retain that payment. And some people then went on and stuck their heels in or found someone else in department or in the social welfare office, and they got increased. So that seems like a very unfair situation where it depends on the person you spoke to. We've had a communication directly from the Department of Culture that says if an artist goes in and says that they're on job seekers allowance, they can ask for that job seekers allowance claim to be suspended on the basis that their trade as an artist has now collapsed completely. I can share the email that came from the Department of Culture in relation to that, and I would feel that if somebody printed that out and brought it into their social welfare office, that they should be in a good situation to get that revised, even at this stage. And I also feel that there's a point to be made that if that person went in and applied or even made an online application for pandemic unemployment payment at the start of all this, and they can show that they should have been moved and they weren't, perhaps they can even get some arrears paid from them. But, you know, let's not be too hopeful here. But as I said, I can share that email to anyone who wants to. My email address is peterdaly10@gmail.com. Okay, a lot of people have asked me about the tax on the pandemic unemployment payment, and that's causing a lot of anxiety in some people's cases. So it is being taxed. As you're probably all aware, or anyone who's ever listened to me bleat on for an hour or two about tax, there are 3 taxes that kick in on your income. The first one is called income tax or PAYE, and the other 2 are called USC and PRSI. The USC and PRSI are not going to kick into your pandemic unemployment payment, so you just need to worry about the first one, which is the income tax, also known as PAYE, just to confuse us all, because PAYE is, of course, the system under which you pay tax as you go. So anyway, this first tax is the one that has 20%, 40%, cut-offs, tax credits, etc. All you need to know is that income tax doesn't kick in until you have at least 15 grand of income. So if you're a self-employed person and you have 15 grand of income, including the PUP, then you still shouldn't have any income tax kicking in because you're still at 15 grand. If you're a PAYE worker and you have at least 16.5 grand worth of income, including the PUP, then income tax won't kick in. The difference between a self-employed or PAYE income is that there's a tiny difference in the tax credits. That's the difference between the 15 and the 16.5. So if you're looking at the whole year and you're kind of going, well, I'm going to get PUP for this number of weeks, say you get it for, I'm not even doing any sums in my head on this time on a Friday afternoon. You can add up the PUP you think you're going to get between now and the 31st of December and add it to any self-employed income or PAYE income and see what level you're landing at. And basically all you need to worry about is that as long as if it's below 15 grand, no income tax on it. If it's above 15 and above 16.5 your employee, the tax will probably be around 20% on it. So, you know, you're not building up a huge tax bill. Obviously, 20% of a couple of grand is a big issue for some of us at this time, but it's not going to kick in above that. Now, if you find yourself in a situation where, just to kind of cover all the bases here, say you had 15 grand already in income between January and February and the first part of March before the pandemic unemployment kicked in, and there's no tax paid on that at all already. So it's all self-employed. And then you have the PUP, you can more or less take it, you'll be taxed at 20% on the bit above 15 grand. I'm throwing a lot of numbers at you. I hope that at least in the back of your head, you can say, okay, where's my income level going to end up at the end of this year? It's going to end up about 17 grand. Okay, it's the bit above between 15 and 17 at 20%. That's 20% of 2 grand. That's 400 euro. That's not too bad, or whatever. So hopefully that'll start. And if anybody wants to come back with more detailed numbers, they're welcome to do that at any point. Okay. Oh yeah, sorry, I meant to say, we talked already that the rate is going to change on the 17th of September. It's then going to change again on the 1st of February. And on the 1st of April, if people are wondering what happens after that, at that point, the pandemic unemployment payment disappears and people move either on to job seekers allowance, which is a means tested payment, or job seekers benefit, which will depend on your credits. Will be in 2021 then. It'll depend on your credits in 2019. So that's just to keep you abreast of that. Next on my list, okay, looking back, small amounts of work or small payments or even not so small payments you may have received in the last while and received the pandemic unemployment payment at the same time. So this is the bit that I'm saying I'm giving no guarantees, and this is a very uncertain area that I'm talking about, but I'm hopefully going to possibly bring a little bit of common sense to this whole thing. We relied, anybody who signed on for the pandemic unemployment payment as a self-employed person relied on the wording on the government's website that said your trade has collapsed to such an extent that you would take a full-time job if you were given one. So look, if any payment came in and it related to work that happened before the 13th of March, then that's a no-brainer. That's just a debtor paying up after the point at which your trade collapsed. So don't worry about that. And if the paperwork isn't in place to back that up, for example, you got paid on foot of a written or an oral agreement, put an invoice in place and put the date on it now that it is before the thing. I'm not suggesting anybody doing anything illegal or incorrect. I'm just talking about putting paperwork in place that reflects the actual situation. What if you've got like, you know, an hour's work doing a voiceover at 75 euro? Look, your trade is still collapsed as far as I'm concerned. So that is not an issue. What if it's higher than that? Or what if it took longer than that? There is the situation where somebody can, I'm going to look forward in a second about people coming off the PUP and going back on it. So let's cover big jobs in a minute, but I'm just talking about going back and possibly getting rid of the anxiety that might be in the back of your head about a payment you may have received. Look, let's face it, if you received a significant payment for something in the past, there's a chance that might catch up to you. And you hopefully, you know, like I'm talking about maybe somebody got 600 euro for something and now they're kind of going, shit, what's going to happen? Hopefully they'll just take the 600 euro back from the pandemic unemployment payment. That seems like the fairest way to do it. That's what they do in terms of a lot of social welfare payments where they talk about a disregard. You can disregard a certain amount and then after that, you're being means tested on the rest of it. So that is my instinct on stuff like that. Just possibly ballpark that amount in terms of it might be a money that you might have to pay back. That's based on, I haven't seen that guidance anywhere. I certainly haven't got that back from social welfare. I know of at least 4 people who rang the social welfare to say, I've got a payment, or I might be getting a payment, or I've just got a small payment. And often these conversations with social welfare start with, well, if you're getting paid for anything, you shouldn't be on this payment. And they often end 10 minutes later with, oh, look, that doesn't sound like a big deal to me. That doesn't sound like a big payment. Look, I'm sure you're fine. Let's keep going as we go and let's see what happens next with the PUP. Now, obviously, that's not going to stand up if you're being audited by someone whose job is to audit social welfare payments. But I feel we have to rely on these anecdotal stories that we're hearing back. And if it's not significant amounts of money and it's not regular money coming in, I feel, you know, common sense has to prevail at this very difficult time. Okay. DEASP, Department of Employment Affairs and Social Protection, have indicated to some people that everybody is going to get checked on this. There's a lot of people on this payment. The idea of them going back and checking everybody, I find a little bit implausible at this moment in time, particularly if they're struggling to deal with 85,000 appeals. Looking forward, we have been told definitively by the Department of Culture and by certain people informally from the Department of Social Protection that people can come off the pandemic unemployment, do some work, particularly as a self-employed person, as a PAYE worker, and go back on it because you are now, once again, your trade has collapsed because of the pandemic, or the job you had is no longer running because of the pandemic. It was only ever a 4-week job to begin with, or a 1-week job. So we know there's a lot of anxiety. What if you come off this payment and you never get back on it? The payment is running to the 1st of April. That's a long time to exclude yourself. We've been given assurances from the Department of Culture that that is possible to do it. And I know of 2 self-employed people and 1 PAYE worker who have successfully navigated that exact thing. The way that they did it was they just came off the claim, which you can do online, possibly give a reason, and then they've gone back on the claim. They haven't indicated that they were on it before, but you have to assume that the Department of Social Protection is linking up PPS numbers. So they must know that already and mustn't have an issue with it. So we've been told by the Department of Culture it's possible. I've been told informally by the Department of Social Protection it's possible, and I've 3 instances where people have actually managed to do it. So I think that's a really useful thing, and I certainly think it's a really useful thing going into festival season where, you know, everybody is doing their utmost to get something up, be it an online or be it an in-person thing. So I'm hoping that people will be able to. But the thing that worried me, and I posted on my Twitter, was the idea that the PUP will be not open to new applicants after the 17th of September. I have an informal, I've been digging around for the last couple of days, and I've had an informal contact from the Department of Social Protection to say that new applicants means brand new applicants and not people who have been on it before. But I'm not saying to anybody on this call to go off the PUP based on that advice, because as far as I'm concerned, that's one person and it's informal. So what we now need to do is we need to get a formal assurance that a new applicant is somebody who has never been on the PUP before. We need to give almost like be available. We almost need to write our own frequently asked question and give it to the Department of Social Protection and the Department of Culture to say, yeah, that is our understanding as well. And that'll include, for example, actor who gets a voiceover that's lucrative, but is only 1 day's work, and they've signed off the PUP for 1 week, and they should be able to go back on it the following week. It includes actor, that's a self-employed situation. It includes a designer who gets a job and it's a 6-week job and they've come off it for the 6th week, and now that everything dries up again in the 1st week of December, they sign back on and nothing happens. We have to cover that. We have to cover a PAYE actor or whoever that works for 6 weeks on a festival show. So that's one of the things I think we really need. Frequently asked question that possibly we draft ourselves, and I'm more than happy to help with that. Basically then, yeah, looking forward. Yeah, one other person just asked me, this might be just a question for a small number of people. SUSI applications. SUSI is the grant body that gives grant level to people whose income is below a certain level for their children are in 3rd level education. And SUSI seems to be digging their heels in and looking for proof that people have ceased trading, but a letter from an accountant doesn't seem to satisfy them. The Department of Social Protection has said somebody can sign on the PUP and make a declaration that they've ceased trading, and they don't need to deregister with revenue. So you're in a tricky situation. SUSI is looking for one thing that the Department of Culture don't seem to need for the PUP. One workaround to cause people as least anxiety as possible is deregister. If you know you've got nothing for the next 4 weeks, deregister on your ROS login, or get your accountant to deregister you for income tax today. Get the notice that comes out from revenue, say you're now deregistered for income tax, give it to SUSI, and then re-register for income tax as soon as something happens, as soon as you get your first piece of self-employed. That can happen in a month or two's time. That's not going to do anything to your filing, because you're deregistering in the middle of a tax year, so you still have to do a Form 11 that covers the whole tax year anyway. I would see it from time to time where somebody deregisters on the 2nd of January and I still need to put in a tax return that has nothing in it for them for that year, because that's just the way the tax system works. So that's a workaround, doesn't cause a huge amount of anxiety, and it's very easy to do. The way you do it is just do it. If you do your own tax return, you can deregister on your own ROS login. If you've an accountant, just ask them to do it. Get your letter for SUSI and then register again as soon as you get the first piece of self-employed income. that's about all I've got, and I'm here till the rest of the call to answer questions. Good luck,
Great.
everyone.
Thank you so much, Peter. There's a lot of gratitude for everything that you're doing coming through in the chat. I'm just going to run through a couple of questions quickly. Do we have the email address if we're contacting welfare about the level? It's a PUP re-rate email. Is that the email?
Yeah, it's PUP re-rate at welfare.ie. PUP re-rate at welfare.ie.
Great, thanks, Peter. Sorry, I'm just going back over these. Is it 20? You're taxed on the 20% of what goes beyond the 15,000. That's right, isn't it?
Sorry, yes, and I got carried away. It's 20% at between 15,000 and 35,300 if you're a single person, and at that point it goes up to 40%. And it's very hard to answer what tax you pay on the PUP without knowing what other income the individual has. It all gets added together, and then basically you look at the overall income, and if it's below 15 grand, you won't have any tax at all on the PUP or any of your income. If it's between 15 and around 35,300 and you're a single person, married is slightly different, but the same concept applies. Between 15, 16 and 35.3, it'll be 20% on your total income, including the PUP. If it's above 35,300, it'll be 20% between the 15.6 to 35, and then 40% above that. Now, you have to get your head around, how do people, if someone asks me what tax I'm going to pay with the PUP, I'd almost put the PUP on top of everything else, and then whatever tax we're going to pay on the rest of it, and then the PUP gets taxed at either 20% or 40%, or if they're below 15, 16 grand, at 0%.
Great, thanks. Angela points out there that that if you only earned the PUP from March to December this year, it would be €14,000. So if that was your only income, it would sit below the tax.
That's really helpful, and Angela presumably means at 350.
Yes, I mean that at the higher rate, and that's an approximate because I'm doing all month 4 and aware that there's 5. So in and around 14 grand if all you got was PUP.
Great, thanks, Angela. A couple of comments here. That someone who has got compensation and cancellation fees from gigs that were cancelled, and DASP said it was grand as long as you weren't actually working for them, as long as it was for someone pointing out that welfare have 5 years to claw back the money, so just to be aware of that. A question about is there such a thing as getting a prorated PUP payment, about getting like the way job seekers? My understanding is no, right? You either, if you want a prorated payment, then you need to be on job seekers and not on the PUP, right?
Yes, that would seem to be the case. And actually that could be something that could be part of what we advocate, that, you know, if you get other income, you lob it off the top. That would seem like a really easy way. Or, you know, just to reflect the difficult time, perhaps the first €100, whatever you earn in any week, is a disregard, and everything above that, you lob off the top of the 350. So say, for example, you made another 200, you would just be taking 100. That's one way to go, and it would be really, really a huge help.
This is interesting in terms of thinking about how we might propose a model for universal basic income, of course, also, and how that works in other countries. Again, just someone flagging that there were people who are still not getting that payment. I think your advice about closing your job seekers claim and trying to make another claim.
Yeah.
And also just on a point about this pressure and scrutiny being applied by CTEC because people are on the live register. I think it's just, but I think the point that you've made is that the experience that people have had of actually closing your job seekers claim to then apply, and that has worked in a number of cases.
It has worked in a number of cases, but in every single case that I know, they got a no first until the thinking was clarified. And actually, not only thinking was clarified, the policy was changed within the Department of Social Protection, where they went, actually, yeah, this does feel a bit unfair. And I particularly know with artists, the Department of Culture advocated for that. And as I say, I have an email. I think it would be really useful to bring the email in. It's from somebody specific in the Department of Culture. It's a government body and government department, and it just shows there is, you know, we have that confirmation in writing.
Great, thanks. A couple of questions.
Peter, sorry, Tom, could I jump in there? Because I've gotten 3 emails in about the last 5, so I'm not sure if it's people who wanted to come or are sending the question, but it's coming up here again. People are asking, A, are there grants from the Arts Council or any other departments taxable? And do you have to come off I know we've covered this before, but you might speak a little bit to it. Do you need to come off the PUP if you get an arts grant?
Yeah,
Angela,
sure.
just if you can, I can jump in there because I was just about to come to that question, and there's another couple of questions which are relevant. So the question about people who get bursaries from the Arts Council or other organisations. Also, there's a question about sales of artworks. If you're a visual artist and you're selling artworks, how would that work? So maybe to take those two questions together.
Sure. I'll talk about the taxability of Arts Council grants. In general, an Arts Council grant is taxable. But when you go into the detail of it, it becomes slightly more complicated. If you apply for an Arts Council grant, if you apply for, say you apply for a bursary is a really good starting point. You usually give a budget, and the budget is partly your time, partly your living expenses, and partly perhaps other stuff like rental of a room or other people you want to get in a room to do stuff. So that's your template. That's your starting point as to what's taxable. The stuff that comes to you is taxable. Now, insofar as it's paying for your, it buys you time and it might cover your rent and stuff like that, that's all taxable because the underlying expense is you have to look at the underlying expense and go, is that tax deductible? Sorry, the money they're paying you for your time, that's taxable. If you have artist exempt, and you've applied for it to buy time for writing, for example, that is artist exempt income and only gets hit with USC and PRSI. But in general, Arts Council funding is taxable. If you get a project funding, it's usually to pay for stuff and people. And the bit that's left over for you, taxable by you, and the bit you pay other people is taxable by them. I hope that answers kind of whether or not it's taxable. I'm not aware of any Arts Council grant that is just straightforward. Sorry, travel and training, because you're paying for travel and training, which is also tax deductible. So you might see it as a plus and a minus, or you might see it excluded from the tax return. So that's the kind of the first part, whether or not it's taxable in the first place. What happens if somebody's getting an Arts Council grant to go and do something, but they're also on the PUP? My feeling about that is that when you make the application, in your head or in the application, box off a period of time for which you're doing whatever it is you're getting the money for. That might be a week, be helpful if it was just a week, but it might be 2 weeks, it might be longer, but let's try and condense it so that you can point to an application and go, I applied for this money, I got the money, the application said I was going to do this with these people on this week, so that's what I got paid. I signed off the PUP on the Friday and I came back on it the following Monday week. To start thinking about it in terms of those type of ways of being able to back it up if anyone asks you the question. That seems like the most logical way to do it. And it's not a new way of thinking, because the Arts Council does, when you apply for a bursary or say a little bit of project funding to do some development, it does make you kind of think about it in terms of people's week's time and stuff like that. So hopefully that's helpful. Was there another tail to that question as well?
Yeah, just about sale of artworks.
Yeah, good question. Yeah. Is the trade of an artist when they're in their workshop or in their studio painting, or is the trade of an artist both that and the selling of it every day? I mean, the person you're probably talking about probably had agreed that sale back in February, I would imagine, and they're probably just being paid for it now. That's kind of...
There might be someone on the call from Visual Artists Ireland or who might have more knowledge about that. If there is, if you could send me a private message on the chat and I'll bring you in. I wanted to bring Karan O'Loughlin from Irish Equity in just to kind of add a few further thoughts to what Peter has said, and then I'll come back to as many questions as I can before the end of the session. Thanks, Karan.
Okay, thanks, Tom. I don't know that there's a whole lot left to be said after that extremely comprehensive presentation from Peter, but I'm just going to cover one or two things. I'm not going to take up a whole lot of time because I do want to leave as much time as possible for the asking and answering of questions. So the situation where we're going to stand, just to recap, from the 17th of October is going to be the rate is going to be split, so there's going to be a 250 rate and a 300 rate depending on your earnings. When we get to February 1st, that's going to further reduce, so it's going to be at the lower earners between 200 and 300, that's going to drop right down to 203, and then the higher rate is going to be 250 for people who had earned more than 300 euros. And as of April 1st, then we're back to regular job seeker applications. So the piece that we had most questions on over the last number of weeks is, what if I get a small piece of work? Can I sign on again? What happens if I sign off? Will I get the PUP again? But as you heard Peter say, we have absolutely clarified now that yes, you can take up a piece of work, you can sign off, from the PUP, and then when that piece of work is finished, you can sign back on again. Now, I don't know what that situation is going to be in September, because they're saying it's closed to new applicants, so we have yet now to define what's a new applicant. Is it somebody who was already on it, came off it, and when you go back on again, are you the new applicant, or is it somebody who hasn't had a PUP claim at all? So that's something I think we can clarify in the next few days, and maybe circulate the answer to people. So and I would absolutely agree that if somebody is getting a bursary or a grant or something, you definitely have to allocate that to a number of weeks. And you can sign off for those number of weeks and say, for that week or those 2 weeks, that's my income for those 2 weeks, that's now gone. And now I want to sign back on again, because that was another question that we sort of had to struggle to try and find an answer to. But I think you can take it that using that method will support you. If you leave the state to take up a piece of work, as people often do, and you return, you can sign back on the PUP, but they will not pay you for the first 14 days, because you will have, if you have to self-isolate, obviously you're not available for work and they won't pay you. So for as long as the self-isolation legislation, or recommendations from the state remain in place, they'll disqualify you for the first 14 days. If you can't return to work because their childcare is not available for you, then the PUP remains available to you under those circumstances. If you're pregnant and your employer or the people who engage you have no work for you because of COVID, you can claim the PUP as well. When your statutory period of maternity leave starts, you go on normal maternity leave benefit. And if when you return from maternity leave, your employer still, the work isn't there for you, you can go back on the PUP after that. So there are just a few pieces I thought that it might be useful to add in. If you're abroad at the moment and you lose a job abroad and have to come back to Ireland, you won't get the cover of the PUP. You just have to sign on a regular job seekers either benefit or allowance. So they're just the small few pieces. And just to say that, like, in many ways, it has become somewhat simpler for people who are self-employed to manage this PUP, because if you have any small piece of earnings whatsoever from PAYE work, right now that seems to disqualify you, and it's much easier. It's the tracing and the identification of this is much easier, because the PAYE system now, they have a live sort of online system, you know, so if you have a job today and another job tomorrow, your tax situation is always automatically up to date. So yeah, so the PAYE thing is still a little bit tricky. So you might have to measure that up to say, well, do I go, because in some cases it could be, if you had pieces of work every week for a number of weeks, it could be considered maybe a short time. So you might be able to do the X and O thing that you can do in social welfare, so payment for some days and not for others. But under those circumstances, I think a conversation with your local social welfare officer would be a good idea, because all of you who will have been in and out of the social welfare system over the years will know that the complexity of your situation certainly depends on who the case officer is. And in some offices, they're really good and they understand the profession, and in others they don't. And you can get a really hard time. So if you're doing bits of PAYE work, especially around teaching or lecturing or anything like that, you need to navigate that really carefully, because you could end up disqualifying yourself. So I'm not going to say any more than that, because you've had a very comprehensive presentation from Peter, and who's covered a lot of ground. So I'll leave it for questions and answers at this stage.
Brilliant. Thanks, Karen. I'm going to take as many questions as we can. Let's try and answer them. I'll try and group them up a little bit, and we'll try and get through as many of the issues as possible. A question, someone who got a few bits of work during the last few months and did them and was paid for them and didn't know that you could sign on and off of the PUP. What should they do about that now? Should they try and rectifying it by contacting it, or just do nothing and hope for the best?
Will I try and field that one?
Yeah,
Peter, yeah.
Cheers, everyone. It's a really tricky one, isn't it? Because nobody has a crystal ball. That person could keep the head down, as I saw they put in their in the chat. They could keep the head down and nothing might ever happen. They could sign on off for a week now and go, look, I'm signing off because of those other for 1 week and I'm going to come back on it. And kind of if anyone ever asks them about those previous payments, they go, well, I didn't know you could or whatever. It's just so hard to tell. I probably would get that person to maybe quantify it, see if it's a significant amount of money, and perhaps because it's already happened because I'm still not, even though we've been told and we've examples of people signing off and coming back on the PUP, there's delays and everything with it. And, you know, I'm not confident about it. Perhaps they could kind of keep that money aside in the knowledge that perhaps they might have to pay that money back.
Great, thanks.
Can I say, Tom, can I just say that they have formalized that sign-on situation now with the Department of Social Welfare. So you can do it through the website, through mywelfare.ie. So there's an absolute formal acceptance now that there is a sign-on system. But I agree with Peter. I think that if it's already done and you didn't sign off, if you sign off now and you sign back on again, if your claim gets interrogated, you might run into difficulties because you have some undeclared income. My advice under those circumstances would be just to wait, and at some stage welfare will flag it with you and deal with it at that stage. But from now on, if you get work, you're going to have to use the sign on, sign off again piece.
Great. There's a question from a few people, a question about your assessment level. Is it for the level of your PUP? Is it being calculated on your gross income or your net, your after expenses? And I guess the question about whether it should be on your gross income or on your net income. On the one hand, you deduct all the expenses before you do your tax return, so that the information that you're providing to government, so that you're only paying tax on a lower amount of it, is the net version. So I guess, Peter, the question is, yes, is it your gross or your what you submit to revenue?
Yeah, it's funny, I had this question from a few people during the week, and actually I think where the confusion arises is that as far as revenue and welfare are talking about, when they talk about gross, they mean before tax. But when we talk about gross, we're talking about before expenses. So it's definitively after expenses and before tax. That's where the confusion has arisen. It's your sales less your expenses, your income less your expenses.
Great, thank you. There's just a question came in about VAT, because obviously the VAT is going down. If, for example, designers are charging VAT on their fees, or if actors are paying VAT on their agents' fees, that will go down to 21% for the period, right?
Yes, it absolutely will go down to 21%. And if the situation is like, particularly with the designer, where often the design budget is the budget. So in other words, you're getting a fee of £5,000, say, to start with the number, and you have to suck up the VAT. You'll get more of the bottom line there. If you're in a situation like me, where I'm charging for accountancy fees, I usually charge a fee plus whatever the VAT is. So the VAT will be passed on to the customer in my case. If you're getting around some, you can suck up the VAT. For agents' fees, you will see that reduction. There's no question. You'll see 2% from 23% to 21%. It all helps.
There's a question about if, for example, you get a bursary for writing, and that's where it would be paying you over a long period. Am I right in thinking, Peter, your advice would be budget a certain number of weeks at a reasonable living wage and go off the PUP for that period, rather than trying to spread it out?
To maximize your income, obviously, you would do that. That's absolutely how you would do it, because otherwise you would be saying to social welfare, I'm now no longer available for work or whatever, and wouldn't get the PUP for whatever that is you had in your head, the 10 weeks or so. I know that somebody had asked a question like about that they in the chat, kind of the culture of condensing the work into blocks is kind of further kind of devalues the work. I get that, but I'm talking about a pragmatic approach to this and making sure we end up with as much money in artists' pockets to keep them going. And that sounds like such an ugly phrase, as much money in artists' pockets. It's just to keep everybody surviving. It's not making anybody rich in any way at all. So yeah, we can have a philosophical discussion about it, but actually it's about just being a little bit pragmatic at this point and getting as much money. So yeah, condense that writing work on the application form and in any, condense it everywhere to a shorter
pay yourself well for a smaller number of weeks, I guess.
Yeah.
I have a question about a couple of questions about the artist's tax exemption. That I think people have had a situation where people have had their PUP rate go down because of income that was tax exempt in 2018, and so their PUP rate has gone down because they weren't paying tax on their artist tax exemption income.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's and perhaps that's something we could include in the advocacy. That's just somebody in social welfare not knowing how to read a tax return, because arts exempt income is still PRSIable, so it still gets hits with the PRSI charge, and therefore it's the one they're reading, the Class S contributions, and it's the one that should be used in the calculation. That's just a straightforward error on the Department of Social Protection's point of view, whoever the caseworker is, because they don't know what artist exemption is. So we just need to make sure it's as clear as possible. It's included in your total self-employed income for PRSI purposes, so there should be no confusion about that. That should be just straightforward, a quick brief given to the Department of Social Protection as to what art is exempting. It's still income, it's still income tax, it just happens to not be hit by one of the three taxes. But I know of at least one person. In fact, the person I have mentioned on Twitter who had that situation where their case was reviewed, they were in that situation. They couldn't figure out if it was a small amount of PAYE in 2019 or if it was artist exempt income in 2018.
Thanks, Peter. Someone who's jointly assessed but earning less than 15,000, would they be better to become assessed in their own right if their partner is falling into the upper tax bracket? There are three ways to be taxed as a married couple: separate treatment, separate assessment, and joint assessment. Separate assessment and joint assessment should always give you the best and the same result. Separate treatment is just you're treated as a single person. So it doesn't matter if you're jointly assessed or separately assessed, you'll get the same tax result. You just have to chase it harder being separately assessed. So be jointly assessed for ease and to make sure you get the best result on a review of your tax. That you can push some of the higher paid income from the higher paid person into the lower person's tax band. In a situation where one person didn't have any income and the other person had a lot of income, of maybe 50 grand, the benefit is about almost 3 grand in tax. Thanks. A question about, again, this has come up before, but someone, the opportunity of doing like a couple of hours a week of, say, singing lessons. Is there a way of offering those lessons and still get a payment from welfare? I mean, I guess in terms of things from before, you can get a pro rata payment on job seekers. I guess another way of doing it is for them to like pay you for the equivalent of a week's work. Is that accurate?
Just to be absolutely clear, what you're saying is, Tom, you do it all in a week.
Yeah, you do it all in a week. So and this would be for self-employed work and not PAYE work. If it is PAYE work and that money is coming in, I'm right in thinking it will knock you off the PUP, right?
Well, I think the same principle applies, Tom. If you were engaged for a week and you got a week's payment, then you could come off for the week. And then if you chose to sort of spread the hours later, I mean, that would be a matter for yourself. But I think that's the best way to handle that.
Great, thanks. A couple of questions about email addresses. Is there any way to speak to somebody about the PUP re-rate? We know that there's 80,000 people doing it, which is why they're doing it on an email address. And someone commented that there's a 2-week turnaround for the email appeals. Is there any way of getting someone on the phone short of bringing Joan Collins?
There is a email, or there is a phone number, and anybody I've spoken to either stayed on the phone for a long time and finally got to speak to someone who pushed them over to the email. The only time the phone number seems to have been helpful is those 3 or 4 cases that I know of people going on to say, I earned a small bit of money, being told in the first instance you should come off it, and then 10 minutes later, each of them had the same story going, you'll probably be okay. But in terms of actually getting the rate reviewed, I'm not aware of any. In fact, I was going to say I'm not aware of anybody who's been successful doing it over the phone. I'm only aware of one person of all the many, maybe 100 people who've contacted me. I'm only aware of one person who's had their rate increased back up to the 350. So that's a significant statistic.
And that was with your TD, but that was also, we now have the text of that letter, which I think people are looking for, which is shared on Peter Daly's Twitter account. You can follow a thread where Peter has put the text of the email about that.
Have a quick read of the email, the text of the email, and just make sure that the language does apply to your actual situation. If you need to tweak it, that's absolutely fine. And yeah, just send it off to, someone asked what's the email to send it off. My feeling is that that's the email to send back when you've been told you are being classified as an employee. It's the email that people are getting to say that they're being kept at the 203 that has 2 lines in red to say, you can only use self-employed from 2018 if you've no PAYE in 2019 or 2020. It's a reply to that email. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. There's a question about some people getting contract work but being paid through a PAYE system because it suits the employer better or because they feel like they have to. What do we do about that?
Gosh, I mean,
I think,
sorry, Karen.
Isn't it the same principle, Peter? Yeah, is it not the same principle as before? It depends on how the work is laid out. I mean, if they're contracting you PAYE to do 1 day a week, then you're possibly in trouble. If they want to say, well, I'm gonna hire you for 1 day a week for 5 weeks, well, then surely they can pay you for a week's work. I think there's a conversation needs to be had with them. It's the spreading out of the work into small pieces that causes a problem, particularly for PAYE people.
A couple of questions about if you're signing off the PUP for other work. There's 2 questions here. Should you sign off the week that you're working or the week that you're paid? And a question about, can you sign off the PUP for a day or do you have to sign off for the whole week?
My understanding is it's a sign off for a week. I think it's a weekly, and it's a funny, I think I said this on one of the last Zoom calls and I can't get it into my head. It's not a Monday to Sunday. It's like a Tuesday to Monday.
It's Friday to Thursday, I think.
Friday to Thursday. Okay. So I think that my understanding is it's quite binary. You're either working in that week or you're not working in that week. So if it's Friday to Thursday, my instinct is just sign off on the we can Google that and make sure that's the right. Sign off on the last day of the week of it. If you stop mangling. If you're starting work the next Monday, sign off on the Thursday before that. Possibly not the week you're actually working. I think you're supposed to. Does that make sense? Yeah, that you're signing off.
I think you'll probably get away with signing off on the first day of work, right? Because up to now, that's what they had been advising, right? The day you go back to work is the day you sign off. Okay. There's a difference between revenue and social welfare in relation to this weekly and daily business, right? Social welfare will insist that they count work in terms of days, and revenue will insist they count work in measures of weeks, right? So in those circumstances, if you're going to get 1 day a week or something like that, or 2 days a week, I would certainly be inclined to talk to the local case officer to say, I potentially may have the opportunity to get a day a week for a couple of weeks. How does that affect me? And if it's going to knock you off and it's a lesser value than 350, then you might want to think about whether you want to take it or not. But bearing in mind that if you say at any point that you have refused work, that completely disqualifies you. So you just need to be careful in talking to welfare by saying, I have a possibility that I may be able to get such and such. And if it falls through for you, then that's okay. But I would never say that I turned it down. You can't say that. Be really careful about that.
I might bring Robbie Kitt in just for a minute. There's a bit of discussion going on based on Robbie's point about the issue with expenses. Some freelancers having substantial expenses, which then results in them, even though they have had a lot of income, not being able to access the higher rate of PUP. Robbie, you might just speak super briefly, because we're just at nearly at finishing time, about this as maybe something that can be followed up.
Yeah, sorry. Thanks very much, Tom. I just was more highlighting this, not for. Thanks so much, Peter, as well, for all these details. And thanks so much for hosting these talks as always. Just the point I was making was less for a detail response to that, but just to highlight that so many artists basically have thousands of euros worth of expenses each year. And so for me personally, I know this is the case for many of my friends as well. We're getting knocked down into lower brackets in terms of when the rate changes to 300, 250, 200. And this is happening because our expenses are being factored in. If our base income was taken account of, we would be actually assessed at higher rates. So I suppose I'm just highlighting this as something that, as an industry, we can highlight together and kind of come at this from a kind of a group advocacy point of view, and just making it clear that by factoring in expenses in our income assessment, we're not being assessed by our income per week, but rather our income minus our expenses per week. And for some people, that amounts to many thousands of euros. So given the fact that a lot of us are in around the thresholds of these kind of brackets, it's going to knock a substantial amount of people, I would imagine, onto lower brackets. And as an industry, as an arts sector, maybe it's something that we can be very, very clear in highlighting, that it's the income assessment criteria is not suitable for freelance artists and workers. Essentially, that's just the point.
Peter, do you have any thoughts about that, or Karen, any thoughts about that?
My only instinct might be just, it's a double-edged sword. I mean, obviously it would be really great if social welfare for the purposes of the pandemic unemployment payment were to do that, but I'd be terrified that then revenue go, great, we'll take a chunk of the higher number as well. So there's a bit of that going on. I mean, I see at this crazy time that would make sense, you know. But yeah, I see what you
I would be mindful of future knock-on effects as well, just as Peter said. But I think that the broader point is that the structure of the pandemic payment is not suitable for freelance artists. And as they reduce it and it morphs into something else, that there is certainly a joint advocacy that all of us should be doing in terms of what is the most suitable for suitable support for artists as we move out of the supports. Because as we moved out of the supports, the arts aren't going to incrementally increase at the same pace because of the nature of your work. And I think Angela mentioned it at the beginning, that on the list of the NCFA asks, which is a really good document, that document, which was a result of a consultation, a very broad consultation, and we absolutely support that ask for universal basic income. And I think that's where we need to be pushing this, because we seem to have a bigger or better ear now at this point than we've had for a very long time. So if we can get traction with the idea of universal basic income, that's the way to go for freelance artists, in my view.
I think you're right, Karen. I think it's in the context of that conversation, but also the update to this memo that we're giving the department. We can include that information from you, Robbie, and hopefully we'll ask Peter again for his huge generosity in this to help us update that memo to government. And I think as Karen says, the doors in both social welfare and the department are wide open at the moment now. So the more information and the more this makes it better for us, because that we can do and that we can do now is the time to do it. And I think what's really coming to the fore in all of these questions is that a number of these fixes, a number of these could be met by a UBI. So what's amazing is that we are making as a sector our own case for, and it could be helpful to other sectors. So we will come back, we will take all this together and put it to the government. We'll then make that memo available on the NCFA website, so you're all up to date, so that your individual cases and offices can be made aware of it as well.
And can I ask, just on foot of this, sorry Tom, it was mentioned earlier on, and I just want to mention it again because I think it's a good idea, that resulting from the questions that were asked here as well, that because they're written in the chat and we're recording, is there a way that we can maybe between us do the FAQs based on that, and then we can make that widely available as well?
Yeah, absolutely. We'll just once we'll get a version of the session available for people to watch back. It'll just take us a little while to do that, and we'll disseminate that through NCFA newsletter and social media and our partners, so that if people want to look over it, and you know, we'll absolutely look at making an FAQ for all of this. I wanted to just grab, I asked if people had last thoughts, so we have one or two last thoughts. Just as a couple of questions about whether we can interpret the issues around staff and the wage subsidy scheme. That really isn't for this meeting. I think Theatre Forum in particular are hosting a number of conversations on this. I would say check in with Theatre Forum, and there will be other briefing sessions for organisations, but we're keeping this as a focus for freelancers, just so that we can be focused. There is a question about if you've already sent an email to Revenue about this PAYE negating your self-employment income. Is it better to wait for a response, or should they send another reply using the updated email as provided from the Joan Collins situation, or will that push your assessment further back in the queue?
Gosh, it's hard to know on a practical level what's going to happen in terms of that. God, let's be as proactive as possible. Let's hope that the first appeal is making its way through the system, and sure, if the second one catches it up, that's fine as well. Obviously, in that situation, you're not responding to a specific rejection of your first appeal, so just modify the language. You know, you could say something like, instead of me saying something like, I see that I've been categorized as an employee, you could say, in anticipation of possibly being categorized as an employee, I would like to point out I had much more self-employed income than the small bit of PAYE or whatever. So yeah, like, don't be afraid to tinker with that email. Make sure it actually makes sense of the situation. I can't imagine you can do any harm sending 2 emails in.
Great, thanks. For very last thoughts, someone who registered as self-employed in May 2018, so it's been calculated on 7 months earnings rather than 12 months earnings averaged over the 12 months. Is there anything that they can do about that, or?
Does that person have some, if that person has some PAYE income in the first few months of the year, that they would be helped hopefully by a total income approach.
Okay, great.
Because the total income approach also protects people who, say for example, you pivoted from PAYE to self-employed just on the 31st of December 2018. So you've got no you know what I mean? You've got no PAYE in 2019, 2020, and no self-employed in 2018. That person has no income at all showing up on the record. So, you know, the rules as they stand are just too black and white.
Excellent. Sorry, I'm just Irma actually has put from Theatre Forum has put a link in there to issues around organizations that Theatre Forum covered in an open forum on Tuesday, which is brilliant. You can check that information there. And Theatre Forum will be doing another event on the temporary wage subsidy scheme and for employers about managing people transitioning on and off the PUP. A question about, is anyone receiving extra payments on top of PUP for their children? And if they go down to lower rates of PUP, will they be able to get it topped up for their children?
Yeah, there's no, as to the best of my knowledge, there's no facility for somebody to claim for children when they're claiming PUP. The advice from social welfare is that you don't claim PUP, and you claim, you just claim your normal social welfare. If your family size is of a certain number, then your entitlement would be greater than 350. So under those circumstances, they recommend you just take the normal social welfare payment. So I hope that answers that.
Fantastic, thanks so much. I think that's bringing us to the end. That's
Can I just say 2 more things, Tom?
Absolutely, Karen.
Yeah, just 2 more things, just by way of information, really. For those of you who also cross over into the audiovisual world of work, there is, if you log on to the Screen Skills Ireland website, they're now starting to roll out training for return to work procedures, etc., etc. That's without cost to the participant. So you'll see that on their website for those of you involved in that. And secondly, for theatre professionals, in Equity, we've had a number of approaches from people.
And we've lost you there.
We've lost Karen.
Being interested in Equity membership, but Equity really didn't expand into the role of other theatre professionals. Yeah, sorry, I think I lost you there. Am I back?
You're back.
Hello? Can you hear me?
You're back.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're doing that
sped
up thing.
I'm using a hotspot, so if somebody rings me, I get bumped off. But so look, in short version, we're going to be hosting a seminar. Equity is going to host a webinar next Friday to talk to theatre professionals, because the executive of Equity have decided to expand.
I think we might leave it there, and if Karen sends us the link for that panel, we'll share it with you all on our newsletter.
So people who work as professionals. I'll call you back in it. I'm having all sorts of issues here, sorry.
No problem. Karen,
I'm sorry about that. I've just drawn your attention to the webinar. We'll circulate information, but if any theatre professional has a question about it or has an interest in it, because the feedback is that people in the theatre sector feel a bit lost or a bit caught adrift from the general world of work, of rights and all that. So anyway, we'll circulate it. So I just wanted to draw your attention to that.
Brilliant, thanks, Karen. It's been really great to have so many people here today. Please share the information among your colleagues. Follow the Campaign for Arts, and at Peter Daly 10, and also Equity and also Theatre Forum on Twitter. Please continue to contact us if there are issues. And just a reminder about the impact that all of our collective action has had with the National Campaign for the Arts over the last couple of months. We're working our way through a 13-point plan that we wrote in collaboration with the sector, and we're starting to achieve those things. And while not every single one of every single thing is exactly everything that we've asked for, we've achieved really a lot, and that is a real credit to all of you around the country, to all artists and arts workers and arts organizations, continuing to have conversations with your friends and your families, with your politicians, and the work has to continue. I think one of the things we were so pleased to hear in Catherine Martin's press conference earlier, she's using wording which has directly come from things that the National Campaign for the Arts has written and published. So we're really having an impact on how the arts are spoken about and considered at every level of this country. And so, we will continue to work together with all of you to advocate and to support the sector. We also couldn't be doing this without all of the resource organisations in the various art forms, Equity and Theatre Forum, Visual Artists Ireland, the various organisations in music and visual arts and dance and the other art forms, all of the independent conversations that have been happening, the independent artists, performing artists, the Artists Union, all of these conversations that are happening, our colleagues in Give Us the Night and Epic and all of these things, this collective effort is really helping us achieve a possibility of a future out of this. Angela, do you have anything to say before we sign off?
I don't think I can say it any more eloquently than you just have, Tom. And just again to give rockstar status to Peter Daly, who is making far more sense of this than any of us could. So with your permission and also with your visuals, we'd just love to give Peter our heartfelt thanks for the work we're about to ask him to do on our behalf and on the sector's behalf. So we'll be back to you. We'll be back 100 times again with hopefully more news. And, if we keep this streak going, another 26 million in another 3 months. So thank you all. Have a great weekend. And thanks again, Peter.
Could I say something very quickly?
Of course.
Yeah.
Obviously, they can't praise themselves, but I'm reading all the NCFA, Playing a Blinder, NCFA are brilliant. And you've been amazing. We wouldn't have got these big chunks of money. We wouldn't have these Zoom sessions if you weren't organising them. So on behalf of everybody else, I'd like to say, Playing a Blinder.
Brilliant. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Karen. Thank you so much from taking time in your car. Thanks, Theatre Forum, and thank you to all of you for choosing to spend this bit of time. And I hope it was of use. It seems from the chat that it has been for many people.
Well
thanks so much, and we'll see you all very soon on screens and hopefully more and more out in the world also. Thanks so much.
See you guys. Have a great weekend.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.